Oye, mira. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 1 of Cape On, a tech activist podcast. I'm your host, Christian Ortiz, also known as ZacaTechO. Recently, I wrote an article called Whiteness, the System, the Lies, the Branding. And as a decolonial technologist and social scientist, my job is decolonizing AI systems. It's why I built Justice AI. In the spirit of decolonizing AI, I took this article and uploaded it to Google's Notebook LM. Analyzing the content of my article, it developed this AI conversation that you're about to hear. This is yet another way I'm decolonizing Eurocentric datasets. Enjoy the show.
What if the very identity you've been taught to cling to is actually holding you back from deeper connection and maybe healing?
That's a powerful question to start with.
It is. And today we're taking a deep dive into a really potent piece by Christian Ortiz, who's a decolonial social scientist and technologist.
Yes, the one titled Whiteness, the System, the Lies, the Branding.
Exactly. Ortiz really digs into how these old colonial power structures are still shaping our world. And in this piece, he's speaking very directly to you, the listener.
Especially listeners who identify as white.
That's right. But he frames it, and we want to frame it not as an attack.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
More like a calling in, an invitation, really.
Yeah, an invitation. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack Ortiz's central argument, which is frankly pretty radical, that whiteness isn't an identity you're born with, it's a fabricated system.
And we want to explore how this system, as he describes it, impacts everyone, not just certain groups.
Right. Including those who identify as white, leading to this kind of collective pain and disconnection he talks about.
Yeah, the goal here really is to give you a shortcut to understanding this complex framework, hopefully sparking some curiosity maybe, instead of defensiveness.
Okay, so let's jump right in. This idea of whiteness as a system, Ortiz really pushes us to think differently here.
You got it.
Saying it's not a natural identity at all, it's a social construct, something built. What does that fundamental shift really unlock?
Well, it's absolutely central to everything else he says. He explains that this whole concept of race, as we know it, was basically invented during early European colonialism.
Okay.
And then it was refined, kind of perfected into a racial caste system around the 1600s.
And the purpose?
The primary design, he argues, was to make white supreme. And everything else, black, brown, indigenous, inferior. Simple as that in terms of design.
Wow.
And Ortiz is really blunt about it. He says, racism, white supremacy, whiteness, it's all the same thing. I need you to hear me. It's all a system, not identity.
That quote really hits hard. It's all a system, not identity.
It does. And what's powerful there isn't just what it is, but how deeply it's been, baked into our understanding as just truth. It's identity.
Yeah, making the idea that it's constructed feel almost like revolutionary.
Exactly. That's the radical insight.
So that shifts the conversation immediately, doesn't it? Away from just individual feelings or actions to these massive systemic forces. And the ripple effect, Ortiz makes clear, is universal.
Yeah, he says everyone is hurting. Some from what they've lived, some from what they've inherited, and most from both.
And that's where it gets, pretty unsettling. Because the source argues this system actually profits from all that hurt.
Right. It normalizes disconnection.
Yeah.
It teaches us to numb out instead of really knowing ourselves. He says it needs division, it needs fear and conflict.
Like that example he gives, getting poor white people to hate poor black people.
So they never realize they're both being exploited by the same machine.
Yeah.
It's a classic divide and conquer strategy, basically.
Yeah.
To prevent solidarity.
So whiteness, then, in Ortiz's framing, isn't a gift. It's bait.
The bait in a trap, yeah. While you're busy defending this thing, you're told is your identity.
Right.
The system is, behind the scenes, stealing your birthright, numbing your spirit, stopping real healing and connection.
He calls it a war between truth and domination. When you start seeing it as a trap, that can stir up a lot of anger.
It really can. And connecting this, Ortiz suggests that what people identifying as white actually inherit isn't whiteness itself.
What is it then?
It's silence, grief, and disconnection. It's a heady legacy. He talks about the weight of racial trauma passed down from colonial ancestors.
Not just guilt, though.
No, not just guilt, more like an unspoken shame. Something that lives in the body, he says, like a quiet virus, passed down through nervous system's survival pattern.
Wow, it's like this invisible burden.
Exactly, an unacknowledged one.
Okay, this brings us to something Ortiz points out. about our reactions. You know, when words like racism or white supremacy come up.
Yeah, that immediate shutdown or defensiveness or anger,
Yeah.
sometimes even feeling attacked.
Right. Many people have that visceral reaction.
And Ortiz helps us see that those reactions, those really strong immediate feelings, they're not just discomfort.
What are they then?
He argues that is not just discomfort. That is a trauma response.
The trauma response, why?
Because, he says, you've been trained your whole life to carry the responsibility of a system you didn't build or told to defend it and not dismantle it.
That's intense.
It is. And he draws on folks like Dr. Risma Menachem, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk.
Major trauma researchers.
Exactly. Who show how these deep collective wounds aren't just psychological ideas. They're literally held in our bodies, passed through generations.
So it's not just disagreeing intellectually, it's like a physical thing.
A visceral conditioned reaction.
Yeah.
Which ties right into what Ortiz calls implicit conditioning.
Okay, explain that. Implicit conditioning.
It's basically learning stuff, behaviors, beliefs, associations unconsciously, without anyone explicitly teaching you.
Can you give an example from the piece?
Sure. Think about media. If you grow up constantly seeing white people as heroes and black or brown people as, say, criminals on TV,
Right.
that sinks in. It can build implicit bias, even if you consciously think racism is wrong.
Or that flinch when someone says racism.
Exactly. That can be a conditioned response, equating talking about race with, I'm being attacked.
Ah, okay.
Ortiz shows how, in a colonial society, this conditioning is a huge tool of control. It makes the rules of the system just feel normal, natural.
So you absorb it without realizing, and then you have to actively work to unlearn it.
Precisely.
And this leads to what Ortiz calls the internal cost of whiteness. He really digs into this.
Yeah, this idea of internalized oppression, where white-identified folks are sort of conditioned to internalize the supremacy myth.
Believing they're the default, the ideal.
Right. But he says there's a huge cost to that belief, a kind of hollowness.
And the response to that hollowness.
Often it's doubling down on the performance. Flags, fear, toxic pride, silence.
But Ortiz argues this isn't just about oppressing others.
No, he's very clear. You are oppressing yourself, too. It's this constant draining performance.
And this brand, as he calls it, demands rigid conformity.
Totally. It shames any deviation. Being queer, poor, neurodivergent, even just empathetic or anti-racist, anything that doesn't fit the mold.
Why?
To maintain uniformity, dominance, and crucially, emotional suppression. Keep that stiff upper lip.
Which must have a huge mental health toll.
Absolutely. He talks about the fear of telling the truth about who they are, people biting their tongues. This emotional silence is the price of belonging.
And he specifically mentions the impact on white men.
Yes, the immense pressure to meet these ruthless conditions. Financial success, stoicism, never showing weakness.
Leading to feelings of failure, depression.
Yes, and tragically, increased suicide risk. He calls it a kind of silent epidemic of spiritual pain.
And Ortiz has such a piercing line on this. That's not failure.
That's whiteness, doing exactly what it was built to do. Convince you that the performance is your identity, and that anything outside of it makes you weak.
Wow. So the system sells this myth of being invincible.
Then crush them under the weight of it, offering only silence instead of care.
That's an incredibly bleak picture. A terrible contract, really.
It is. It leads to this deep spiritual emptiness. Maybe explains why some traditions or holidays can feel hollow, just performing.
And this emptiness, this performance, it connects to Ortiz's really provocative take on American culture.
Ah, yeah. He really challenges the whole idea of a deep ancestral American culture.
What does he say it is then?
He argues America doesn't create culture, it markets it.
Markets it. Like brands.
Exactly. He lists examples. Coca-Cola, Bud Light, Marlboro Reds, monster trucks, baseball, football, hot dogs, fireworks.
Walmart patriotism, country music, all the stuff we're told is American.
Right. And he argues these aren't really original. They're often stolen pieces, reassembled through corporate imagination, and sold back to the public as pride.
Wow, so elements taken from other cultures, maybe.
Often, yeah. Then just smothered in stars, stripes, and white exceptionalism.
Even the American flag itself.
He says it's often presented less like a sacred symbol of unity and more like a corporate logo, a costume for empire and consumption.
So, my childhood 4th of July memories were basically just an ad campaign.
It's It's a jarring thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that's his point. It's about generating buy-in, not actual belonging.
America doesn't teach you to belong. It teaches you to buy in.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
And then he finishes the section with, in this country, you don't inherit your identity, you subscribe to it.
Subscribe to it, a service.
Yeah.
Okay, and building on that, this manufactured identity, Ortiz then hits on a really sensitive point. The tension between claiming your actual ancestry and claiming whiteness.
Yeah, this is where he directly tackles that common statement, my ancestors are Irish or Italian or whatever.
What does he say about that?
He asserts that those European immigrants, they weren't white in Ireland or Italy. They became white here by giving something up. Their language, connection to land, rituals, maybe histories of resistance, solidarity with other oppressed groups.
They had to trade it in, essentially.
That's the argument. And his message is stark. You cannot claim your ancestors before colonization and claim whiteness at the same time.
They're incompatible.
In his view, yes. He says whiteness is not your heritage. Whiteness is what buried your heritage and handed you a flag in return.
Buried your heritage. Wow.
Yeah. He sees whiteness as the interruption of legacy. It pulls you out of connection with your specific people and puts you into this broad artificial caste system.
And he says, whiteness tells you to be proud, but it gives you nothing to be proud of.
Right. There are no white drums, no white lullabies. It's empty of deep cultural roots, he argues.
To really hammer this home, Ortiz shares a personal story, right? About his DNA.
He does. It's compelling. He talks about his DNA results showing, I think, 16 distinct ancestral regions.
16.
Europe, Africa, the Indigenous Americas, a real mix. And then he asks the killer question. Tell me, what race is that? You see the problem.
Yeah, you can't fit that neatly into racial boxes.
Exactly. He says race cannot explain this. It was never meant to, because race was never about lineage. It was never about truth. It was about power.
Always about power.
That's his point. So if you, the listener, like Ortiz, carry multiple bloodlines or even just one distinct one, you're not broken or confusing.
Yeah.
You are, in his words, the evidence that race is a lie.
Okay. So if race is a lie, whiteness is a system, a trap. What's the way out? How does Ortiz see a path towards healing, towards collective liberation?
He offers something profound but also really challenging. He says, grief is the path back.
Grief. Not anger, not action first.
Grief first. He argues that ache, that feeling of not knowing where you come from, that sense of being spiritually bankrupt, that's a signal.
A signal that went.
That whiteness has run its course, that the illusion is crumbling. The need, he says, is to mourn what was taken.
Mourn the heritage that was buried.
Yes. And break the contract with whiteness. To consciously walk away from the branding and go find your roots.
That sounds like deep work. Unlearning and rehumanizing.
Exactly. It means shifting the question from what race are you to something like what happened to your people and how are you carrying it? Seeing it historically, ancestrally.
It's about seeing racial identity not as who you are, but as this.
Colonial spell, he calls it. Something that disconnects us from our ancestors, from each other, and from ourselves.
And understanding that, then, leads to a sense of responsibility to dismantle the system itself.
That's right. Ortiz is crystal clear here. Whiteness is a system. It's not your fault you were born into it. But it is your responsibility to dismantle it.
Yeah.
He sees terms like racism, white supremacy, colonialism, privilege, not as personal insults, but as diagnostic terms. Like a doctor naming an illness. They're meant to wake you up to the structural infections.
But the system has trained people, especially white people, to hear those terms differently.
Right. To hear them as personal threats instead of institutional truths. That's the conditioning.
So what's the solution he proposes? It sounds radical.
It is. He basically says, if every white person collectively demanded the removal of race from the legal, economic, and institutional fabric of society.
If everyone just said, no more.
Racial capitalism would fall apart overnight.
Yeah.
That collective withdrawal of consent, that's what truly threatens those in charge, he believes.
That's a huge if, but a powerful idea.
It is. And he acknowledges that waking up to all this, it hurts. It brings pain.
But he says,
good. That pain is the beginning of truth. It's necessary. It calls for grieving the lost culture, the rituals, the silence.
And grieving the ways whiteness hurt you, even while making you complicit.
Exactly. And his final powerful thought in the piece is, you weren't born white, you were born whole.
You were born whole. So just to recap our deep dive today, the core argument from Christian Ortiz is that whiteness isn't an identity, it's a system.
A manufactured brand, yeah. One that comes at a really high personal cost. It sells you a false identity while burying deeper truths.
And true liberation, he argues, involves grieving what was lost when that system was imposed and reclaiming your full humanity, your wholeness beyond these constructed racial lines.
Yeah, as Ortiz puts it so well near the end, we can't heal what we won't name. We can't reclaim what we won't grieve. And we can't build what we won't imagine.
Naming, grieving, imagining. Okay, so we'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. If race, as Ortiz argues, is a lie designed for power, what hidden truths about yourself, about your actual ancestry, might be waiting for you to uncover once you stop defending the lie?
Something to really sit with.
Definitely. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.